What if royal blood didn't make you pure, just harder to catch? Behind the pearls and portraits lie 15 women of crown and chaos, queens and courtesans who rewrote the rules of power with whispered liaisons and velvet rebellion. This isn't the fairy tale you were told. This is the royal family's unspoken history, of secret lovers, forbidden affairs, and reputations so scandalous they were buried beneath stained glass and silence. These aren't just princesses, they're problems. Welcome to 15 female British royals who slept with everyone, where the crown was heavy, but the nights were rarely cold. Before we dive in, if morally questionable monarchs are your thing, go ahead and subscribe. We do this often. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what unholy hour is it as you're listening to royal scandals in the dark? 1. Katherine Howard. There are two types of people who become royalty: those who play the game and those who are played by it. Katherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, managed to do both, spectacularly. She entered the court like a teenager walks into a nightclub with a fake ID, underdressed, overconfident, and entirely unaware of the consequences. A cousin to Anne Boleyn and a pawn of the ever-ambitious Howard family, Katherine was shoved into the royal marriage market like meat in a Tudor butcher's shop. By the time she became queen, she had already cultivated a quiet trail of hearts in her wake, including music teacher Henry Mannix and the dangerously charming Frances Dereham. The gossip didn't start when she became queen. It just got louder. Henry VIII was bloated, aging, and nursing a festering leg ulcer. Katherine was 19, gorgeous, and surrounded by men who were better looking, better smelling, and far more her type. Enter Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber with enough swagger to risk death for a few stolen nights. It was the kind of mistake people in Tudor England rarely got to make twice. Was she guilty? Maybe. Was she reckless? Absolutely. But the frenzy that consumed her downfall had less to do with justice and everything to do with vengeance, power, and the kind of royal hypocrisy that still manages to look shocked when women have desires of their own. Katherine wasn't the only queen who strayed. She was just the one who got caught, and not even very well. And as her head rolled onto the block, you could almost hear the court too. Mary, Queen of Scots. If Katherine Howard was the cautionary tale, Mary, Queen of Scots, was the slow-motion train wreck people couldn't look away from. Tall, striking, and fluent in every language that mattered, Mary was bred for royalty and romance in equal measure. Unfortunately, she got far too much of both. She was widowed at 18 when the King of France died unexpectedly. And that was the most stable part of her love life. Her return to Scotland was met with suspicion, religious friction, and an elite society that operated like a cold-blooded chessboard. Mary naturally played checkers. Her second marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, started with fireworks and ended with actual ones. The man was murdered in a suspicious explosion while recovering from illness. The leading suspect? James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, who was either Mary's true love or her worst mistake, depending on which historian you ask and how much scotch they've had. Some say she was kidnapped and forced to marry Bothwell. Others say she arranged the whole thing and helped cover up Darnley's murder. But here's what we do know. She married Bothwell just weeks after her husband exploded. Court gossip, always eager to fan the flames, painted Mary as a lustful queen whose passions cost her everything: her crown, her freedom, and eventually, her head. But the true scandal wasn't that Mary had lovers. It was that she had power, and that she dared to wield it like a man. It frightened them. It still does. She died a prisoner of her cousin, Elizabeth I, whose own love life would raise more than a few powdered eyebrows, just not in quite the same way. And if you've made it this far, you're clearly one of us, fascinated, slightly horrified, and in too deep to stop now. So hit that subscribe button for more late-night royal misbehavior. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Be honest. Is it already too late to be hearing about exploding husbands? 3. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. Queen Caroline of Brunswick entered England like a scandal in search of a headline. She was loud, eccentric, slightly unwashed, and gloriously indifferent to the suffocating etiquette of British court life. In other words, she was perfectly unsuited to marry the future George IV, a man so vain he once commissioned a statue of himself wearing Roman armor, and then complained it didn't flatter him. Their marriage was a disaster before the ink on the royal stationery dried. They met for the first time just days before the wedding, at which point George promptly asked for a stiff drink and publicly declared her repulsive. She responded with a tone-deaf optimism and a wardrobe that could only be described as violently continental. When George ditched her almost immediately, opting for mistresses, fashion, and his own bloated self-importance, Caroline packed her bags and began touring Europe like a chaotic divorcee on a spiritual bender. She collected lovers the way George collected gout, taking in secretaries, Italian servants, and one especially charismatic valet named Bartolomeo Pergami, whose close relationship with the Queen was as subtle as a cannon blast. The British government launched a full-blown investigation, complete with witnesses, depositions, and dramatic accusations of nightly tumbles, indecent exposure, and, gasp, sharing a bedroom. Parliament was scandalized. Caroline, meanwhile, went sunbathing and laughed in Italian. They tried to bar her from George's coronation, which only made her more popular. She showed up anyway, banged on the doors, and got turned away. A literal queen denied entry to her own husband's party. It was the stuff of political theater, if the theater served gin and everyone had syphilis. But while Caroline was outliving her shame, another royal woman was discovering that infidelity wasn't just a whisper behind palace curtains. It was a lifestyle made for flashing cameras and vintage cigarettes. 4. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. If Queen Elizabeth was the crown, Princess Margaret was the cigarette smoke curling around it. Raised in the same gilded cage but never expected to rule, Margaret had all the pressure and none of the power, which made rebellion less a choice and more a hobby. And oh, did she excel at it. Her early love affair with Peter Townsend, a war hero and divorcee, sent the monarchy into a moral panic. Royal protocol strangled it in the crib, and thus began the long arc of Margaret's romantic history. Too passionate for her title, too titled for her passions. When she finally married Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, it wasn't so much a happy ending as it was a new battleground with better decor. They were glamorous, artistic, and mutually unfaithful. He photographed everyone. She drank everything. Roddy Llewellyn, the 25-year-old landscape gardener she took up with in her 40s, became tabloid gold. Their Caribbean vacations were paparazzi catnip. Margaret didn't care. She'd already been banned from happiness once. She wasn't about to ask permission this time. Her lovers came from all walks. Actors, artists, musicians, obscure aristocrats whose names sounded like inherited furniture. The press called her scandalous. She called it Tuesday. What unsettled people most wasn't the affairs. It was the audacity. Margaret refused to apologize. She wore heartbreak like eyeliner. She turned palace walls into velvet boudoirs and made protocol look like a punchline. If the monarchy was a theater, she was the tragicom. 5. Henrietta Maria of France. Henrietta Maria arrived in England in 1625 with a French accent, Catholic beliefs, and the kind of unapologetic confidence that made English Protestants clench their teeth. She married Charles I, who adored her in that peculiar, dependent way that weak kings often love strong women, with awe, confusion, and a growing political liability. She didn't waste time making friends. The court found her foreign, the Puritans found her popish, the public found her suspicious. Henrietta found them all deeply uninteresting. She brought with her a retinue of French courtiers, a flair for theater, and what the gossips of Whitehall called too much influence. She also had charm, the dangerous kind, the sort that makes a nation nervous when aimed at the wrong men. Among those wrong men were a revolving door of diplomats, artists, and soldiers. Were they lovers? Possibly, possibly not. But Henrietta's greatest affair was with power itself. She was fiercely loyal to Charles, even raising armies in his name during the English Civil War. Yet rumors swirled like London fog. Whispers of quiet meetings, midnight confessions, and foreign men too familiar with the Queen's corridors. Parliament accused her of seducing England into tyranny. Pamphlets painted her as a manipulative temptress, a Catholic spider in the Protestant web. Henrietta, ever theatrical, fled to France in disguise, then returned with ships and silver and a reputation so blackened it practically smoked. Her husband would lose his head. She would lose her kingdom. But her legacy endured in the embers of suspicion she left behind. That dangerous, unspoken idea that a queen could be more than a figurehead and that her affections once wept. 6. Mary Boleyn. Mary Boleyn was the original Tudor enigma, beautiful, desirable, and consistently overshadowed by a sister who would become queen and then famously lose her head. But before Anne ever caught Henry's eye, Mary was already making headlines, or whatever passed for headlines in a world where court gossip traveled faster than actual news. She was dispatched to the French court as a teenager, where she was said to have become a mistress to King Francis I, who reportedly referred to her as his English mare, a charming reminder that even Renaissance kings struggled with basic decency. Whether the affair happened or not, the damage to Mary's reputation was irreversible by the time she returned to England. Enter Henry VIII. Bold, impulsive, and deeply uninterested in fidelity, Henry was drawn to Mary's charm like a moth to a future crisis. Their affair was brief, largely undocumented, and thoroughly erased from official record, a royal tradition that continues to this day. But many believe she bore him children, or at the very least, secrets. Unlike her sister Anne, Mary never played the long game. She wasn't after a crown, which ironically may have saved her life. After her affair with the king ended, she slipped into obscurity, only to scandalize her family again by marrying a man far below her station for love. The horror. She died quietly, without titles, without execution, and, perhaps most scandalously of all, 7. Katherine Parr. Katherine Parr was Henry VIII's sixth wife, a position that came with the dubious honor of being the final contestant in a particularly grim royal dating show. By the time she entered the scene, Henry was old, sick, and emotionally scorched earth. Katherine, on the other hand, was sharp, devout, and already twice widowed. A woman well acquainted with both the crown and the coffin. But behind the pious reputation and Protestant pamphlets was a woman who, long before she became queen, had already lived a life worth whispering about. She had been romantically involved with Thomas Seymour, the younger, handsomer, and significantly more scheming brother of Jane Seymour, before marrying the king. Their relationship was paused, not ended, when Henry decided he liked the look of his nursemaid a little too much. When Henry died, to the great relief of half the country and most of his wives, Katherine didn't wait long. She married Seymour within months, causing court eyebrows to rise so fast they nearly left orbit. The speed was suspicious. The motives? Even more so. Their marriage wasn't exactly a fairy tale. Seymour was ambitious, Katherine was newly liberated, and both were under the unblinking eye of young Princess Elizabeth, who lived in their household. Rumors bloomed like mold. Flirtations, late-night visits, and awkward tensions swirled through the corridors. Historians still argue over what exactly happened. But whatever it was, it ended in heartbreak and public disgrace. Katherine died shortly after childbirth. 8. Lady Caroline Lamb. Lady Caroline Lamb did not tiptoe into scandal. She cannonballed into it, petticoats flying. Born into aristocracy and married to future Prime Minister William Lamb, she was expected to behave like a good Victorian wife, subdued, supportive, and stylish in a way that didn't call too much attention to itself. Instead, she chose Lord Byron. Their affair began in 1812 and quickly escalated into one of the most explosive and public romantic disasters of the Regency era. Byron, the brooding poet who was somehow both a national treasure and a walking red flag, was notoriously impossible. Caroline, however, was not the kind of woman to be discarded quietly. She famously described him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He described her as a little volcano, which, to be fair, was accurate. When Byron ended the relationship, Caroline did not take it well. She stalked him. She wrote him angry poetry. She cut her arms at parties, the 19th century version of a messy Instagram breakup. She once disguised herself as a man to sneak into his home. Even Byron, whose threshold for chaos was famously high, started locking the windows. Her behavior was labeled hysterical. Her passion, madness. But underneath it all was a woman ahead of her time. Unfiltered, unafraid, and utterly unwilling to pretend that her emotions were anything but volcanic. 9. Queen Isabella of Angouleme. Queen Isabella of Angouleme had one job: marry the King of England and produce heirs. What she did instead was become one of the most whispered about queens in medieval Europe. A woman whose post-widowhood love life was so robust, it practically required its own chapter in every monastery's complaint log. Married to King John. Yes, that King John, the one who lost Normandy, enraged barons, and was basically a walking disaster with a crown, Isabella was thrust into royal life as a teenager. She did her duty, bore 5 children, and endured a marriage marked by political failures, public dissatisfaction, and widespread rumors of John's violent temperament. But the real story begins after his death. Still young and stunningly beautiful, Isabella returned to France and decided, rather boldly, that she would not be withering away in a convent like some royal relic. Instead, she surrounded herself with lovers, nobles, knights, and one particularly scandalous relationship with the Count of Lusignan, whom she may have taken up with while still married, or right after. Timing is fuzzy. Gossip, however, is not. She married the Count officially and bore even more children, ruling her lands with a mix of elegance and iron. The French court called her indecent. Chroniclers implied she was immoral. But Isabella seemed unmoved. She wasn't interested in redemption arcs. 10. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. Princess Louise was Queen Victoria's 4th daughter, but she didn't act like it. Where her siblings were dutiful, pious, and predictably in line with their mother's iron-fisted expectations, Louise was artistic, outspoken, restless, a sculptor in a world of stamp-collecting royals. She didn't just rebel. She sculpted rebellion in marble and placed it where everyone could see. Her marriage to John Campbell, the Marquis of Lorne, later the Duke of Argyll, was one of those political convenience matches that came with more cold drafts than warm feelings. Whispers suggested he preferred the company of men. Whispers also suggested that Louise didn't mind, because Louise, long before and after her marriage, was rumored to have lovers. Not the safe, aristocratic kind, but the sort of people her mother would have had arrested for being interesting. One alleged affair, with her sculpting tutor Joseph Edgar Boom, left court insiders gasping into their monocles. When Boom died suddenly during a private meeting with Louise, the palace covered it up with the frantic energy of people who have buried more than just secrets. And then there were rumors of dalliances with artists, poets, and even her brother's tutor. What made it all worse, or better, depending on your perspective, was that Louise was genuinely talented. She broke barriers as the first female royal to attend at 11. Queen Elizabeth I, they called her the Virgin Queen, which is exactly what you call a woman when you don't want anyone asking too many questions. Queen Elizabeth I spent her reign tiptoeing through a minefield of court intrigue, religious warfare, and male advisors who assumed their job was to mansplain England to her. She handled it all with a combination of razor wit and velvet gloves. But behind the public armor was a woman whose private life became the nation's favorite unsolved mystery. The most enduring figure in this mystery was Robert Dudley, childhood friend, master of the horse, and frequent occupant of Elizabeth's private chambers. The rumors began early and never stopped. His wife, Amy Robsart, died from a suspicious fall down a staircase, and suddenly the Queen's dear Robin looked less like a courtier and more like a liability with nice calves. Elizabeth never married. Not Dudley, not the Archduke Charles, not the French Duke of Anjou. Instead, she kept her suitors close and her power closer. Her relationships were strategic flirtations, politically useful, emotionally complex, and designed to leave everyone guessing. The court buzzed with tales of moonlit walks and passionate letters. Some believed she took lovers. Others believed she didn't need to, that power itself was her obsession. She weaponized her singleness, turning her lack of a husband into an enduring symbol of England's independence. But behind the iconography and portraits was still a woman, surrounded by men she might have loved. 12. Queen Anne. Queen Anne's reign was defined by wars, alliances, and a level of chronic illness that would have had most monarchs abdicating by lunchtime. But her emotional life, the one behind the heavy curtains and somber portraits, was a thicket of dependency, devotion, and relationships that blurred the line between friendship and something more. She suffered through 17 pregnancies and buried every child she ever had. The result wasn't just personal grief, it was isolation. Into that void stepped Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough. They were childhood friends, turned confidants, turned co-rulers in everything but title. Sarah was bold, brilliant, and deeply manipulative. Anne was devoted to her in a way that unnerved the court. Their correspondence reads like a Victorian breakup album, intense, poetic, and laced with jealousy. Sarah accused Anne of being too attached. Anne begged her to stay close. The Queen signed letters with phrases like, "Yours till death." Court gossips read between every line, and then some. When the relationship finally fractured, it wasn't quiet. Sarah was replaced by Abigail Masham, another woman who gained Anne's affection and stirred fresh accusations of unnatural closeness. Satirical pamphlets made sure everyone got the message. They didn't need facts. They had suspicion. And suspicion in royal circles is worth its weight in exile. 13. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria gave us the Victorian era, a time synonymous with prudish morality, buttoned-up etiquette, and the slow, polite suffocation of anything remotely fun. But the irony, of course, is that the woman behind the stiff portraits and empire-sized grief was once passionately obsessed with a man in a tight uniform. She just happened to be married to him. Prince Albert wasn't just her consort, he was her son, her gravity, her human diary. Their marriage was shockingly intense for a royal pairing. She wrote love letters that read like Victorian fan fiction. She worshipped his intellect, his punctuality, his moral superiority, and occasionally, his figure. After his death, she wore black for the rest of her life and made national mourning a full-time aesthetic. But grief didn't make her any less human. Enter John Brown, a gruff Scottish servant who spoke to her like a person, not an empress. Their relationship scandalized the court. He was seen holding her hand, whispering in her ear, even shouting at her when she needed it. She called him my dearest friend. He called her woman. For the prim and proper elite, it was basically blasphemy. Rumors of a secret marriage bubbled. She denied them. The public judged. She didn't care. Statues of him were quietly removed after her death, as if history wanted to pretend the affection hadn't happened. But the truth clings to the margins. Victoria, the matriarch of imperial propriety, had a soft spot for the unwashed and honest. And if she made emotional chaos look dignified, the next queen didn't bother pretending at all. She rode across continents, married 2 kings, and turned romantic scandal into something closer to folklore, centuries before tabloids had the vocabulary to handle it. 14. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine wasn't just royalty. She was the blueprint for every historical figure who refused to stay in her assigned box. She married not 1, but 2 kings. She led armies in the Crusades. She outlived enemies, outmaneuvered allies, and helped birth a dynasty that would rule for centuries. And somewhere between the politics and poetry, she earned a reputation as the most scandalous woman in Europe. She first married Louis VII of France, a man so pious he practically smelled of incense. Their union was rocky, sexless, and childless, depending on which monk you ask. After years of incompatibility and a failed crusade that included Eleanor allegedly riding into battle in armor, they split. It was scandalous. She was 30, beautiful, and suddenly the most eligible and dangerous bachelorette in Christendom. Enter Henry Plantagenet, soon to be Henry II of England. 10 weeks after her annulment, she married him. They had 8 children, countless political feuds, and a marriage that read more like a rivalry than a romance. Eleanor was accused of everything from adultery to witchcraft. She was imprisoned for supporting her sons in rebellion against Henry. Her legend only grew. Rumors swirled of lovers from her youth, troubadours, knights, foreign royals. She was said to have bathed in milk and ruled from her bedchamber. Most of it was propaganda. 15. Nell Gwyn. Nell Gwyn wasn't born into royalty. She seduced her way into it with a wink, a good joke, and a talent for knowing exactly how far she could go before getting herself thrown out of the palace. Which is to say, not very far at all. Because by the time she was 20, she wasn't just surviving Restoration England. She was starring in it. She began as an orange seller at London's theaters, hawking fruit and flirtation in equal measure. But it didn't take long for her to step onto the stage herself. Nell was funny, bawdy, and unashamed, a woman who played the comedic foil while quietly rewriting the script. Audiences adored her. So did the king. Charles II had a long list of mistresses, but Nell was the one who made even that list look fun. She was never a duchess, never a schemer. She didn't come with powerful relatives or European ambition. What she did come with was charm, and timing, and a sharp tongue that could deflate even the most pompous aristocrat with a well-placed insult. She bore the king 2 sons, famously referred to one as His Majesty's bastard, and once told an angry mob, "I'm the Protestant whore," just to shut them up. History tried to shame her, but Nell beat them to the punchline every time. She was a mistress who didn't pretend to be more, and somehow became unforgettable because of it. When she died, Charles's final request